Now on BBC4, clang, clang, clang. All aboard as Time Shift charts the golden age of the trolley.
There was a point during the Second World War when my father took up the double bass. To recall the trams of my boyhood is to be reminded particularly of that time.
Trams were so evocative of Alan Bennett's childhood that he's recorded his warmth and affection for them in a short story called Leeds Trams.
We live over the shop, so I sleep and wake to the sound of the trams. The trams getting up speed for the hill before Wheatwood Lane, trams spinning down from West Park, trams shunted around in the sheds in the middle of the night, the scraping of wheels, the clanging of the bell.
For a century, from the 1860s to 1960, trams were a familiar feature of Britain's roads. They opened up new places to live, new possibilities for work and opportunities for leisure, and they became synonymous with seaside holidays. For many, they were also a wonderful and comforting part of their childhoods.
They are so typical of the age from which they came. When I think about them, I think about good times in my boyhood, and I suspect a lot of other people think the same.
This takes me back to when I was definitely a diddy man. When I was a diddy man, we used to travel everywhere. My brother and my sister and my father and mother, we used to travel. Everybody did by tram.
They clank, don't they? Clonk, 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 clonk. And it's a lovely noise, and then they go around a corner and scream, and you get this business on a point, and everybody sort of goes from one side to the other. There's nothing else on the roads like a tram car.
It's not just the passage of time that makes me invest the trams of those days with such pleasure. To be on a tram sailing down Headingley Lane on a fine evening lifted the heart at the time just as it does in memory.
Years ago, the only form of passenger transport was horsepower. But it wasn't a smooth ride. In the days of unmade, uneven roads, a horse bus was a far from comfortable experience.
Horse buses often had a problem actually going down some of the roads because of the potholes, because of the mud. You would need sometimes 4 to 6 horses to pull a horse bus, which didn't actually carry that many people.
The clue to the way forward lay in a system of rails and horsepower, first used to move limestone between Swansea and the Mumbles.
If you were to lay a rail down, which was the original idea with tramways, that you would lay a hard surface in a soft road, you could actually use fewer horses and carry more people.
This same technology was adapted to carry tourists on horse-drawn carriages. The system was ingenious, and the world's first tramway opened in South Wales in 1807. But with Welsh modesty, it went almost unnoticed. It took a bold and brash American, the appropriately named George Francis Train, to get the whole of Britain on the right tracks.
He's what we might call a transport mogul now. He built a railway across America, a shipping line to Australia. He's the person that Jules Verne based his character Phileas Fogg on, Around the World in 80 Days.
Train had witnessed various forms of tramway being tried and tested in the US from the 1830s onwards. While working for a shipping company in Liverpool, he crossed the Mersey to neighbouring Birkenhead. It was here that Train did his bit for Britain. He launched the first horse-drawn regular tramway service setting in motion the beginnings of an urban public transport network and the birth of the commuter. And train never did anything in a low-key way.
Well, we're on the site of the inaugural picture in 1860, when George Francis Train recorded this event, and all the people carefully posed, packing the tram. One of the persons is pointing outwards up the street there. That's George Francis Train himself.
Next, Train headed for London, where things didn't run so smoothly. His early tramways ran on raised rails, not a problem in semi-rural Birkenhead, but in the capital, chock-a-block with horse-drawn carriages, it was a nightmare. He was arrested in 1861 after his raised rails caused chaos to other traffic.
The inquiry into the summons taken out against Mr. Train for breaking and injuring a certain road, called Uxbridge Road, was resumed. Thomas Clark, a cab proprietor of Mile End, said he drove over the tramway in his own horse and cab, and it caused his horse to fall down. He had a fare going to Hyde Park. When asked, "Where was your horse when it fell?" he replied, "On his backside."
The problem was overcome by dropping the rails to the level of the street, and by 1870 Train's tram was back in business. Other towns and cities began following his lead, and horse-drawn tramways started to be seen on high streets and promenades. These trams were posh. There were little front parlours on wheels.
The original horse trams were sumptuous. Utrecht velvet is on the specification, and beautiful wood. You can see the tram we're in. There's lovely figured oak and bird's eye maple. 3/8 a foot that cost, by the way.
Early trams had a complex way of turning round at the end of the line. Being long and cumbersome, this clogged up the middle of the busy, bustling urban centres. Dual-ended trams that didn't need to turn round eventually solved the problem and were quickly pressed into service.
They were lightweight construction, so they could travel a bit faster than horse buses. And they had a number of interesting features. They had bells to alert the driver when to stop. They had uniformed staff, strap hanging. We can see in the tram that we're in now, some straps, efficient braking, and features that we would really call modern to make this modern streetcar.
Won't you ride in my little red wagon? I'd love to pull you down the street. I'll bet all the kids will be jealous when they see my playmate so sweet.
At first, it was only the well-to-do who could afford the threepenny fare. The open-top deck was the place to see from and be seen in, as the ladies and gentlemen of Victorian Britain looked down on the riffraff below. It would be many years before tram travel would be available to all, especially to those who lived and worked in the teeming towns and cities of mid-19th century Britain. Overcrowding was particularly hard on the poorest in slums, which heaved under the stench of filth and vermin. Sickness was rife. For them, there was no way out.
The working poor hardly moved from area to area at all. All they could do was walk. There was no real capacity for walking or incentive to walk. There was nothing to go to except the local public house, so people remained very, very set in their own locations.
Pressure would only start to be relieved by the exodus of the middle classes, who were first to escape. They began moving to new houses on the outskirts of towns. To serve their transport needs, a citywide integrated transport system was needed, and it would take a young Bristolian, George White, to help make that happen.
My great-grandfather, Sir George White, was a self-made man. He was the son of a painter and decorator and a lady's maid, and he was born in Bristol in 1854.
George White was one of the most influential figures in Britain's tram history. He left school at 14, joined a local law firm as a lowly office clerk, and learned all he could by reading the law library. In 1874, his firm took over the reins of the fledgling Bristol Tramway Company, and White, still only 20, was made company secretary. He teamed up with James Clifton Robinson, who had been George Francis Train's office boy back in Birkenhead, and who had squeezed onto that first British tram ride some 14 years earlier.
It was really James Clifton Robinson who provided the engineering skills, and George White who provided the inspiration, the direction and the finance. And between them, they changed the face of tramways in Great Britain.
In Bristol, they would show how a tram system could transform a city and the lives of its residents. It would become a model copied throughout the country.
One of the things that trams did in the big cities was to allow the suburbs to be built. It made it possible to join neighbouring villages. By running the trams out in the direction of these villages, building followed, building of houses in particular. And it was in this way that those living in the inner cities and the cramped inner cities were able to move out to the suburbs.
Trams played an important part in the physical expansion of towns and cities, which finally had room to breathe.
The trams were first introduced to relieve this massive overcrowding in the centre of towns and cities, but it was the middle and upper classes who took advantage of them, because they were the people who could actually afford to buy the houses on the outskirts of town and then could afford to actually ride backwards and forwards on the tram.
By the 1880s, trams were becoming increasingly popular, and new routes were springing up. Lifelong tram enthusiast Peter Davey has his own bijou museum in his up and over garage. It's filled with artefacts charting Bristol trams over the years and includes route signs for many of the local districts.
These are the boards that go along on the side of the tram, so you know what route you're on, and the lovely gold hands on the end. I've got quite a good set here. Dad bought these a penny each when they were scrapping the trams. They've all got two routes. This is Westbury and Tramway Centre, and of course on the other side up you've got Zetland Road to Old Market, you see, so that could be used on any two routes but a different colour.
For Alan Bennett, there is a greater significance in the link between suburbs and route numbers.
The route numbers had a certain mystique, the even numbers slightly superior to the odd, which tended to belong to trams going to Gipton, Hare Hills or Belle Isle, parts of Leeds where I'd never ventured. And Kirkstall will always be 4, just as Lawnswood is 1. Odd details about trams come back to me now, like the slatted platforms, brown with dust, that were slung underneath either end like some urban cowcatcher. And how convivial trams were, the seats reversible, so that if you chose you could make up a 4 whenever you wanted.
If we look over here, I've got one of the seats on the top deck. Top deck seats, they were all open top decks in Bristol. Trams do this all day, they don't turn round at the end. So when you get to the terminus, you've got to change the seat. So now they're ready to go back the other way. But Bristol had a rather clever thing. Imagine this in a wet day. You get up the stairs and you see all this and it's all wet. Are you going to sit on it? No. But look, we have a flap here and you pick it up and there's a dry bit of wood that's coming up. And you can sit on that quite happily. And when you get off, it goes back all by itself.
As new tram routes emerged, the number of horse trams on Britain's streets multiplied at a galloping pace. And more horse trams meant more horses. Horses and other animals became almost as common on the streets as people, and the smell in the cities often resembled a farmyard.
A horse deposits 30 pounds of poo per day. It also wheezes out 2 gallons of urine.
In Liverpool, they had 400 horse trams, and for every tram they had 14 horses.
You can just imagine the vast piles of poo, basically, that built up in towns and cities. And there have been some academic papers written which directly link the horrible conditions and the amount of dung on the road to infant mortality in inner cities. And so it was a massive problem.
It wasn't just a poo problem. Horses were expensive. For every 3 horses pulling a tram, another 9 had to be fed and stabled as they were used in shifts. Tram technology needed a more efficient source of power. Steam was the next choice. Steam-powered ships and locomotives were commonplace in Victorian Britain, with over 10,000 miles of rail track running between major cities. But when steam-run trams huffed and puffed into the urban centres, they caused a lot of hot air.
People believed that if they were running through the streets, they were terrified of the noise they made, they didn't like the fire, they believed they'd blow up, they'd frighten horses, and they'd kill people.
The public didn't like it very much because they all got on white and they all got off black, and it wasn't the best of movements.
Steam had its uses in Britain, but steam trams never took off.
Richard Tanguy, who made steam engines, actually said thus was the trade in quick-speed locomotives strangled in its cradle, which is a marvellous turn of phrase.
But a new power was available: electricity. Electricity was a phenomenon that few people had experience of, and even less understood. At the start of 1881, the first electricity generator was installed in Britain. Within just 4 years, the first electrically powered trams would be running. But as with horse and steam power before, the transition to electric trams wasn't going to be problem-free. The introduction of electric power coincided with the explosion in another industry: tourism. It was time to pack a bucket and spade and head for the seaside. And it was in Blackpool that the first electric street tram was launched in Britain. She proudly paraded along the prom, lauded like a royal visitor. But unlike passing dignitaries, she was here to stay.
The tramway was actually first opened on the 29th of September 1885, and we'd always looked at trams a long time before that because Blackpool Council wanted one, but they didn't want to do something old-fashioned. So they looked at horse trams, they'd looked at steam trams and thought, we don't want anything that's noisy or smelly, we want something clean and fresh.
From that point on, trams were as much a part of Blackpool as kiss-me-quick hats and seaside donkeys. By the turn of the century, Blackpool had become Britain's busiest resort, attracting more than 2 million holidaymakers a year. For thousands of factory workers from the north, there was the annual trek to the town. They worked hard for 51 weeks a year, and for their single week's holiday, their Wakes Week, they wanted to be treated. A ride on a tram was far removed from the humdrum of daily life, and it was a taste of things to come.
They were beautifully done, their seats would be upholstered. I mean, for working people, it was all part of their holiday, their Wakes Week or their day by the seaside or something like that. And of course, often they'd be sort of decorated. And I mean, Blackpool really, a lot of the prosperity of Blackpool always seems to me to rely on the trams going up and down the prom, to look at the illuminations.
Mill workers, and not only mill workers, but many other people going to Blackpool who wanted to do all these spectacular things, you know, noted for fresh air and fun, wear the comic hats and eat the stick of rock. Being on a tram, they were an ideal vehicle for doing just that.
But it wasn't all plain sailing. Blackpool's trams were initially powered by an underground conduit system, which meant the electricity was run through channels under the road surface. This quickly became an issue.
Because the line was directly on the seafront road and basically married up with the beach, every time the tide came in, of course, it flooded, and seawater is a wonderful conductor of electricity, and it used to blow all the trips in the substation. Everything would come to a grinding halt. And similarly, on dry days when the wind blew, all the sand came off the beach and filled the slot up. So we had to hire horses to pull the trams.
Sparks flew as transport engineers researched and experimented to find the most workable system of running power to the trams. One imaginative solution was found in the Midlands.
This is a surface contact stud, and this system was used in Wolverhampton, and what happened was that there was a large magnetic skid under the tram which would be in contact with two of these studs at any one time, so you wouldn't just get a surge of electricity each time you went over a stud. And the magnet would draw up the contact inside the stud, and so the surface of the stud would then become live. When the magnet passed away, the contact would drop down, and then in theory the stud would be dead. Now we know that in Lincoln there was a different method of surface contact used to this one, but in Lincoln we know that horses were killed, and we also know that street urchins with bare feet were paid in order to put their foot on this just to test whether the thing was alive or dead.
Apart from the danger to street urchins, this wasn't the long-term answer. One after another, transport chiefs all came to the same conclusion: overhead cables. Electricity would be supplied by wires suspended above the road, through a swinging arm to the motor of the tramcar, then back via the wheels to the rails with no risk of electrical shock to pedestrians. At last there was a technology which was safe and reliable, but still there were hurdles to overcome.
On the whole, householders reckoned that it would increase the value of their houses, and shopkeepers certainly felt that it would increase their trade. But of course there were those who thought they were ugly, noisy and disagreeable, and they certainly didn't want them in their district.
The public liked the convenience of tram travel, but didn't like the disruption that came with it. Sites had to be cleared, roads dug up. Every time a new scheme was proposed, there were huge debates in pubs and Parliament. People wanted them, but not crossing their backyards.
Even if you don't mind the noise and dirt and dust of trams, actually laying the lines is a very expensive and a very inconvenient business. Other forms of transport just run on the ordinary road. Trams have to have roads of their own, and the simple process of laying those means a town is disrupted or streets are disrupted while it happens.
George White and James Clifton Robinson in Bristol spearheaded the push to get electrified trams established in early 20th century Britain.
In order to persuade the locals, they published newspapers in every parish and district where the trams were going to run. They supported pro-tramway councillors, they campaigned at elections, and of course to achieve all this they also had to straighten streets, widen them, rebuild them, strengthen bridges. And that set off a second sort of tramway bonanza.
As White and Robinson extended their empire all over Britain, new corporations and entrepreneurs also saw transport as a way to capitalise on this spirit of inventiveness.
Britain really was a fairly entrepreneurial society. This was the time of people investing in the new Britain, making money by developing things that a growing population with slightly higher wages and urban living patterns wanted and needed.
Electric trams coming in, the motor cars coming in, people sometimes actually saw an aeroplane flying through the sky. This is the technological beginnings of New Britain.
More and more people took to trams, and they started to become the recognised system of mass transit. In just 4 years from 1900, 102 tramway systems were introduced in towns and cities around Britain.
The opening day was regarded as a day en fête. In London, the Prince of Wales presided over an extension of the tram system. by standing with his hand on the lever. It was said in the newspapers that he didn't actually drive the tram. That he wouldn't have condescended to drive it, but he stood there with his hand on the lever while he was photographed. The tram company produced penny tickets, which were called the Prince of Wales tickets for the inaugural day, with the Prince of Wales feathers on the ticket. Trams became fashionable. Trams became things which were desired by all the citizens down to Britain.
The British loved their new trams, not least because they provided ideal vantage points for any public event.
This is a very typical British tram of the era. You can see even the backs of the steps have this pattern work on. Now, there's absolutely no need for that sort of thing. It was just the pride in the vehicle and the corporate and civic pride, because it must have taken quite a lot of time and quite a lot of money to actually decorate the vehicle in this way. And you find that all over the vehicle as well. There's a coat of arms which is etched into the glass of the door. There's the gold leaf painted around the side panels and the coat of arms on the side of the tram. A lot of basically unnecessary embellishment just for the sheer joy and civic pride of it.
For the working man, something major had changed: the price. As fares were slashed, trams became the transport of the working classes.
The penny ticket on the horse-drawn tram became a penny for travelling 2 or 3 miles longer than had been the case when it had been the horse. And because the journeys were cheaper, the journey became more frequent. In Manchester, in the days of the horse-drawn tram, the average working man made about 50 journeys a year. Once the electric tram came in, half the cost, he made 150 journeys a year. It just made it possible because it was cheap.
Tramcars started to be held dear to the hearts of those who relied on them every day. In 1905, music hall star of the day George Lashwood even sang about them.
Then we go for a ride on the car, for we know how cozy the tops of the tram cars are, and the seats are so small and there's not much to pay. You sit close together and spoon all the way. Many a miss will be missed someday through riding on top of the car.
On a sunny day, there was no better place to be than riding on the top deck of a tramcar. In the wind and rain, it wasn't so much fun, but at least the passengers could huddle inside. There was no such comfort for the driver, however.
The poor old driver would stand here in all weathers, and there's no protection at all from the weather. He'd very often have big leather gauntlets so that he possibly wouldn't get frostbite, and he'd have a big overcoat. But it was a pretty grim way of earning your living. If you can imagine, you're stood up all day throughout the winter, come rain, snow, and just standing, driving here for hour after hour.
Other more user-friendly models managed to give the driver at least a little shelter. But space was at a premium, as tram companies wanted to make money, and that meant getting bottoms on seats. Various designs of stairways were tried to leave as much space as possible for seating, though the best solution created problems of its own.
The staircase spirals down this way and takes up less space than the one which would spiral the other way. But the big disadvantage with this is that you actually can't see if you're a driver over this shoulder. So a pierced step was put in so that you could see through and ensure that nothing was coming past the vehicle on the left-hand side. Now that's fine, but a tram is the same at both ends and doesn't turn around, and so the conductor on the return journey would have to stand on this platform. The pierced step would then mean that he could catch a glimpse of a lady's ankle. So there's this. To protect the modesty of the ladies, the decency flap. Now if the conductor didn't have that down, when a lady was going up the stairs, he could probably be dismissed if the inspector saw him.
Yet times were changing, and attitudes were about to be challenged. During the first